According to the APA, it says the inclusion of the diagnostic criteria for prolonged grief disorder in DSM-5-TR allows clinicians to use a common standard to differentiate between normal grief and this persistent, enduring, and disabling grief. And so when I talk about normal grief, what they're referring to is this experience where someone has a loss and they experience grief, this internal sadness, internal anger, frustration, feeling overwhelmed, stressed. And what happens as time goes on, the individual gradually comes to an understanding and acceptance of the loss. Now, when it comes to acceptance, it doesn't mean they're happy. It doesn't mean that they like that they had a loss. It means that they've come to a place in their life where they're not struggling with their reality. Some people might say they've made meaning of their loss. And many times when people experience normal grief, they're able to engage in daily functioning. So they're able to go to work, they're able to go to school and continue on with schoolwork. They're able to engage in daily life and do the things that they need to do. So that's normal grief. So for example, let's say a father loses his daughter, and let's say 2 years after his daughter's death, he begins to have concerns, difficulty focusing, difficulty concentrating, having intrusive thoughts about his daughter. Now, the rest of the year, he's able to function, go about his daily life, make meaning of the loss, accept the reality of the loss. But when the holidays came up, when the anniversary came up, some of those symptoms popped back up. And so according to them, according to DSM and other specialists in the field, he's known to have experienced normal grief because majority of the time he's able to function in daily life. And as we're going through the DSM-5 here, you'll hear the length where the symptoms have to be present. So actually, let's go ahead and do that. So the first one, criteria, symptoms last most days, at least 12 months after the death for adults, and at least 6 months for children and adolescents. And so here in the community mental health related, more specifically, 6 months was very concerning for a lot of us. When it comes to 6 months, many times a lot of people will experience a lot of these symptoms. And so the concern was, why did they say 6 months? And there's a lot of different avenues people take, a lot of different speculations people make. One speculation that's very common is related to medication. So if somebody has a diagnosis in the DSM, then they're more likely to be able to take medication. And so that was a slight concern. Was this an avenue to promote medication? So that you might hear a little bit of that, especially for those who are already acclimated to the community, the deaf community and the mental health. And you've probably already heard a lot of concerns related to that. But I did want to briefly mention that. So again, for adults, it's 12 months, and for children and adolescents, it is 6 months. Going to the next criteria, it says at least one of the following symptoms is present. In addition, the symptoms as occurred nearly every day for at least the last month. Be intense yearning or longing for the deceased. And I want you guys to remember that, because we're going to come back to that here in just a little bit. Preoccupation with thoughts of memories of the deceased. And in children and adolescents, preoccupation may focus on the circumstances of the death as well. The next criteria is the death, at least 3 of the following symptoms must be present. Identified disruptions, such as feeling as though part of themselves has died. Marked sense of disbelief about the death. Some of you might simply say denial. Avoidance of reminders that the person is dead. And children and adolescents may be characterized by efforts to avoid reminders. So I want to pause here just for a moment when it comes to avoiding reminders. So there's this concept called acute grief. For those of you previous training that I've done, you're already familiar with acute grief, but just in case you haven't, acute grief is an early time period after the loss. So this is when there's a lot of intrusive thoughts. This is when the person might have difficulty getting out of bed. This is when the person might have a lot of memories coming to the forefront. It's hard for them to focus and to concentrate. And so whenever you have a client coming in and they've recently experienced a loss and they're experiencing the acute grief, and let's say they go by a restaurant where they first met their partner who has died, and they're sharing with us, I'm getting panic attacks every time I go by that restaurant. Us as a clinician would probably encourage them, let's avoid the restaurant until we're able to get some coping skills under our belt. And so, according to the DSM, within the first 12 months for adults, first 6 months for children, it is okay for them to have those panic attacks and not be diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder. We're going to talk about another disorder we can diagnose them with within the first 12 months or first 6 months. But after that 12-month period, after the 6-month period, and they're still experiencing panic attacks, they're still avoiding those certain areas or certain triggers for them, then that's when it becomes a concern. And that's when we can diagnose them with prolonged grief disorder. The next one is intense emotional pain, such as anger, bitterness, and sorrow related to the death. Difficulty reintegrating into one's relationships and activities after the death as well. So example, problems engaging with friends. And we're going to talk a little about that more when we talk about youth, but pursuing interest or planning for the future as well. Emotional numbness is another criteria. Feeling that life is meaningless as a result of the death. And lastly, intense loneliness as a result of the death as well. And when it comes to disturbances causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The duration of severity of bereavement reactions clearly exceed exceptional social, cultural, or religious norms for the individual's culture and contact. I really like this section. In the ICD-11 by WHO, World Health Organization, they went a lot deeper into the cultural aspect, but it is important that we take that into consideration when we're meeting with our clients, asking about their culture, asking them about kind of what's expected of them in their social settings. So for example, let's say you have a client coming in and they identify themselves within the African-American community or the African community. There are some African cultures, some countries in Africa where the first time period after the loss, the people mourn and grieve however they want to. And then after a certain period, that's when they come together and they celebrate the person who's died. So that's an example of how culture can play a role in the duration as well. Some places in the Middle East, when someone is grieving, it could be years after someone has experienced a loss. They may go out into the street and cry and mourn, however they need to mourn. They outwardly express the hurt that they're having inside, and they'll walk down the street. And by the time they get to the end of the street, it could be 20, 30 people gathered together, grieving and mourning. So when we hear stories about that, when we recognize our client's culture and the duration goes longer than the DSM, technically speaking, we're unable to diagnose them with prolonged grief disorder. So that's something just to keep in mind. And so the next one are associated features. We won't go through all of these. I'll just briefly run through them. Intense yearning, longing for the deceased. Again, we'll talk a little about that more here in just a moment. Person experiences maladaptive cognitions about self, guilt about the death, and diminished future orientation as well. And when it comes to guilt about the death, there's a lot of tools and strategies that we can utilize. As I encourage you again to take a look at the previous training I had done. I really honed in quite a bit on guilt and how to give people support, especially individuals who's experienced suicide in a family or a friend, or little ones who interject themselves into stories. And we're going to talk about that here in just a moment as well. Somatic complaints occur. Little ones, many times, with stomach aches, decreased self-care, hallucinations about the deceased. Now, I do want to mention with hallucinations, that is quite common for children to experience. Children usually preteen to teens, younger teens, will many times share with family, share with friends that they saw the person who has died. And then bitterness, anger, restlessness, blaming others for the death, and decreased sleep quantity and quality.